So despite the efforts of the Southern status quo to terrorize the populations, both freedmen population and individuals that they saw as complicit in helping the freedmen population, despite their efforts and Andrew Johnson's efforts um, to reunify and allow the status quo to kind of run those former Confederate areas, Congress will, during the presidency of Andrew Johnson, really seize control of Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson was a president who was really a president without a great deal of support. The southern states that were still seceded, because of course Congress had not ceded the delegations that Andrew Johnson had claimed were legitimate delegations from the South. Congress hadn't ceded them, so those states remain seceded. And as a result of that, Congress will now establish a more rigorous process whereby those states can be brought back into the Union. And because of that, Congress is still dominated by the North, and Andrew Johnson doesn't have a lot of allies in that government. The president doesn't. And so the Congress will begin to pass laws which Andrew Johnson will veto, but Congress will start to override that presidential veto with a 2/3 majority. And this allows Congress to really seize control over Reconstruction and to take actions to fight against the black codes in the South, to fight against the attempt by the former Confederacy and the President of the United States to sort of allow a reestablishment of the status quo. The first major congressional action was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Andrew Johnson vetoed it, and the Congress overrode his presidential veto. So this is the first time Andrew Johnson's presidential veto was overridden by Congress. And the Civil Rights Act was passed, demanding rights regardless of race and banning of the black codes. Civil Rights Act of 1866 kind of built into a fundamental constitutional development, the 14th Amendment, which of course, and states that were being brought back into the Union had to ratify this amendment. That was oftentimes was a part of the agreement of states being allowed back in the Union was to ratify this amendment, this change in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which of course has to be approved by Congress with a supermajority and by 3/4 of the states in order to become part of the Constitution. And an amendment like the 14th Amendment, by the way, amendments cannot be vetoed by the president. So the 14th Amendment is passed, ultimately ratified in 1868, meaning it was ratified by enough states, 3/4 of the states, for it to become part of the Constitution. And this was an incredibly significant, piece of constitutional change. And this, I think you would say, is a long-term success. I don't think you would say this. I know you would say this. The 14th Amendment is a long-term success of Reconstruction. Even though many of its significance was negated initially, its long-term importance it's arguably the most important part of the Constitution. The 14th Amendment says it's the amendment that establishes birthright citizenship. Because now you had freedmen populations that weren't counted as citizens. And so this led to the 14th Amendment saying, if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. So that means that all of the freedmen are citizens of the United States and do full constitutional protections like other Americans. It also goes further in effectively arguing that no state may violate the constitutional rights of its people, so that you're protected by the Constitution, and no state can say that you have sort of different protections than other people, that your constitutional rights are protected federally, no matter what a state's legislature might like to do. A state cannot violate your constitutional rights. And this, of course, was intended to bar southern states from passing race-based laws like the black codes. in order to establish the a white supremacist status quo and repress the African American population. It's an incredibly significant piece of legislation and long term a huge success of Reconstruction. The results of this short-lived congressionally led Reconstruction were actually the appointment of the first African American members of the federal House of Representatives and the Senate. Hiram Revels was the first African American senator, and here you see Revels pictured to the left. I believe this is Revels right here, along with African American members of Congress, the first ones ever elected to the federal government. Now, of course, many of the former Confederates at this time are still disenfranchised. And so the Congress is overseeing a kind of reforming of many of the legislatures and governments in the Confederacy and allowing African Americans to participate in the electoral process in those areas. And so these are some short-lived successes of Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment, of course, is a very long-lived success of Reconstruction, one of the most significant elements of Reconstruction. But in the short term, there were glimmers that maybe if the country has the will, maybe this will be a development that will be able to continue and create a sort of new reality across the country in which people are not discriminated against for race, down the line, of course, gender, sexuality, these types of things as well. Andrew Johnson, of course, had fought vehemently with Congress. He was stubborn. He fought with him. He vetoed congressional acts. Congress overrode his veto. This leads to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson's impeachment, and Andrew Johnson did not attend the inauguration of the next president, Ulysses S. Grant. That's only happened now in American history 4 times. John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Johnson, and in 2021, Donald Trump have chosen not to attend the inauguration of the president, the inauguration of the next president. Andrew Johnson also refused to attend that inauguration. Now, he's impeached. The impeachment of Andrew Johnson was very much a political affair. What had happened was Congress had passed something called the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act was an act that was, in a way, Johnson was kind of set up for this. Congress sort of wanted to be rid of Johnson, and they sort of knew, members of Congress sort of knew that he would probably fall into this trap. This was a bit of a trap, and this would allow them to impeach him. What Tenure of Office Act meant is that once an individual was appointed to an individual's cabinet, a president's cabinet, that the president could not remove them. And so there was an individual within Andrew Johnson's cabinet, the Secretary of War, I believe it was, who was basically not working with Johnson. They didn't see eye to eye. He was more of an ally of the members of Congress. Johnson removes him. Congress says you violated the Tenure of Office Act, and they impeach him. In truth, it really was not really, I think most constitutional historians would agree, not really an impeachable offense. And indeed, the Tenure of Office Act itself was probably unconstitutional because it was a congressional law dictating, what the president could do with his cabinet, which of course, who the president appoints to his cabinet is a very clearly established item in the Constitution. So the Tenure of Office Act itself was probably unconstitutional. Of course, that's no longer in place, obviously. But Johnson faces an impeachment trial. They sold tickets for this trial. I thought I had a ticket stub. Usually I have a ticket stub for you, but I guess I forgot to put the ticket stub in there. But there's tickets sold for this trial. It's a huge event, in many ways, almost like a spectator event, the way you might imagine such events, today. And Andrew Johnson escaped impeachment by a mere vote. That's how close he was from um, being removed from office for his violation of the Tenure of Office Act. Why does Reconstruction fail? The failure of Reconstruction really starts in the 1870s, and despite the fact that this is President Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, he was elected president um, in 1868, inaugurated in 1869, and um, President Grant, of course, the hero of the Civil War for the Union, the leader, the individual who accepted the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, um, famous for his victories in the Battle of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, and of course, later in 1864 and 65, defeating the Confederate armies of Robert E. Lee. Grant became president. His administration became associated with a great deal of corruption. We'll talk about that when we get to the Gilded Age in this class. But, Grant crushed the KKK when he was president, the Ku Klux Klan. He sent federal marshals down there that basically waged a war on the KKK, crushed the KKK. So that was certainly good in the interest of Reconstruction. That was certainly a good thing. Grant also was president, even though a president can't veto an amendment, but he was president when the 15th Amendment, which provided the full manhood suffrage, the right to vote for all men, was ratified. So in that sense, initially, Grant's presidency becomes associated with, some positive developments in Reconstruction. But ultimately, it's despite those things, despite the things that Grant did during his first term as president, the 1870s ultimately meant a demise of Reconstruction, the failure of Reconstruction. And the reasons why are really probably related to a number of items that are connected to racism in the country and to economics. So in the early 1870s, the country fell into what they called these panics at the time, but it was really a depression, the Panic of 1873. The country fell into this depression. So the economy went downhill. Remember too, racism is not something exclusive to the South. There's a tremendous amount of racism in the United States, all across the country and in the North as well. There's a new group of Republicans, the radical Republicans, were out. They had lost the majority of Congress, and instead they were replaced by so-called liberal Republicans. Now, liberal Republican does not refer to the way we think about liberal today, liberals with respect to social programs and so forth. Liberal refers more to economic notions. So a liberal with respects to economics is an individual who believes in free market economics, like no government regulation. And so the liberal Republicans were really interested in economically rebuilding the country. And this meant that they didn't want to fight over issues of equality, over ideals of constitutional protections and people's right to vote. Instead, they wanted to get the South back on an economic footing so that the South could provide agricultural and raw materials to the industrial North, and the economy of the country would start to turn again. And so the rise of liberal Republicans, depression, economic issues, racism in the North, and or indifference to the sort of ideals of Reconstruction as well, all factored into a really failure of the sort of overriding goals of Reconstruction, the ideals of Reconstruction, which was racial equality, equal representation, constitutional protections before the law, right to votes, these types of things. The final demise of Reconstruction occurs with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in an event known as the so-called, some would have called it the corrupt bargain of 1877, or the compromise of 1877. So Rutherford B. Hayes ran for the presidency in 18 1876, and he was inaugurated in 1877. But before his inauguration, the country went through a real intense political battle over the returns from this election. There were disputed election returns from four states, so no one actually knew who had won 4 states, and those 4 states would determine who had a majority of the electoral college, who had the majority of the electoral college, and thereby who became president. And so the presidency was decided by an electoral committee in the House of Representatives. And of course, the Republicans had a majority in the House, so the committee was chaired by more Republicans than Democrats, and it was going to go to Hayes, naturally. But those supporting the Democratic side of things, and the South were very angry over this because they saw this as unfair, and it led to a political dispute in Congress in which they ultimately, behind closed doors, made an agreement that Samuel Tilden, who was the guy who ran against Hayes, the Democrat, would accept defeat, and Hayes would be allowed to take the presidency if Hayes agreed to formally end military reconstruction in the South. And that is what happens. Tilden concedes, accepts defeat, Hayes is made president, and in response, Hayes officially pulls the last troops out of the South, and officially ends Reconstruction in the South. And effectively, Reconstruction would have some major sort of achievements. The 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment are incredible and significant achievements long term. But in the short term, Reconstruction fails. You see a return to status quo and white supremacy in the South. In the short term, the gains made by the 14th and 15th Amendment are really all but eliminated. This was through the passing of Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are laws that were intentionally designed to take the vote away from African Americans. They had literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses that allowed white individuals to not have to take those tests. And so basically they were charging African American people money that they couldn't afford to vote. And if they could afford it, they would make them take a test in which the test was intentionally designed for them to fail. The overwhelming majority of individuals in those areas, white or black, would have failed those tests. And in effect, those laws eliminated the short-term gains of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now, one might naturally say, well, what about the Supreme Court? Wouldn't they say this is unconstitutional? The reality is the sort of tendency to racism in the United States at this time went throughout the country. And the Supreme Court would infamously make a number of decisions, but particularly the decision known as Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court decided in 1896 that states could be segregated, that laws like this could exist as long as institutions were equal. And so separate but equal allows for the establishment of segregation in the American South in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision. And in other ways and through other measures, the establishment of Jim Crow laws will largely negate the gains made by the 14th and 15th Amendments.